This is the latest version of the Radrover. This is the Radrover 6 Plus from Rad Power Bikes. I am not affiliated with Rad Power Bikes in any way, but I do like to make aftermarket parts for other bikes. And this is one that we've had probably the most requests for. So the upgrade is here. That means a new motor controller, a new display, and that means more power. So I'm going to show you how to put one on. There are two pieces we need to install, and I would say it's fairly simple. Unfortunately, it is a little more complicated, or there's more parts involved to doing this change than there was on the older Radrovers. That's just because of how things are integrated into the new frame, but I'm going to make this as easy as possible. So this is the new motor controller. The motor controller now sits inside the frame here. It's tucked up in there. It's real small and compact, and it's kind of a pain to get to. Fortunately, we don't actually have to take it out. We just have to unplug it. So that means we just have to get to some of the wires that run down on the frame right here. So the new motor controller, this guy, we're going to put it right down here behind the seat post. You could put it in front of the seat post if you wanted to. I just don't think it looks as clean right there. You don't have to worry about this thing getting ruined by weather. It's totally sealed up, weatherproof, and all the cables and connectors are going to run inside the frame with the exception of the motor cable, but they all are waterproof connectors anyway. Now the stock motor controller will only communicate with the stock display, and the Radrover has kind of a weird setup where you have two displays. You have one on the left that shows some basic information and one in the middle that shows a little more. The one on the left has the buttons. The one in the middle is just a display showing more info. This is going to change to a more, I guess, traditional type of e-bike display where you're basically going to have one bigger screen in the center, which is vertical, and then you're going to have your buttons over on the left-hand side. So we're going to change the display out, which is going to be fairly easy, and that's so it can communicate properly to the motor controller. And then there's some small setup items to do on that. We'll run through all of it. And if you're wondering, why would I need this? Do I need this? Really, it comes to, in my mind, the biggest benefit is power. This motor controller is rated for 35 amps. You don't actually have to run 35 amps through the controller. You can use less power than that, but it makes the bike way more powerful. This is effectively a 500 watt bike with a 750 watt peak. I would normally rate my bikes 750 watts with a peak that goes higher than that. I like to rate them at the continuous power level. These are a little bit more mild than that, so the power is a little underwhelming in my opinion. So instead of going out and buying a brand new bike with more power, why not just upgrade the one you already have? Before I disconnect anything, I'm going to say that the first thing you should do is make sure your bike is working as is, because if there's some sort of problem already, you don't want to get confused with the new parts that are going on the bike. But if everything's working on your bike, it turns on, the power works, the throttle works, brake cutoff switches work, pedal assist works, most of those components are going to be reused. So that's just a little tidbit I throw in there because every once in a while I get somebody that emails, they want to do some troubleshooting, and after not figuring things out, I ask, well, was that working before? Well, no, it wasn't actually, and I bought this hoping it would fix the problem. So let's pop the battery out. We're going to use the key right here to pull the stock battery out, and we're just going to set that aside in a safe place. And here comes the fun part of accessing some little tiny teeny screws. And I've already got one out right here. There's 4 holding this metal plate in. They use these tiny little Allen heads. These are rather tight from the factory. The main advice I would have on these guys is 1, try not using a ball end Allen wrench because you're more likely to strip a small fastener like this. And 2, make sure you're using the correct metric sizes. These are bicycles. They use all metric parts. Do not use standard sizes. That's probably going to end up in stripping something out for sure. But if you've got some sort of bicycle multi-tool, doesn't really matter what it is, it's probably going to have all the tools you need. Like I said, these are pretty small. Make sure you've got a container or somewhere you can set these where you're not going to lose them, because we do need to put these back in when we're done. So with the 4 silver screws out, now this metal tray, I'm going to call it, can come out. So we're just gonna pull that out of the bike and set it aside. This is kind of a weird design if you ask me. Ideally, you want your cables to be as short as possible. If you can believe this, some of these cables actually run from up near the handlebars. They run down through the frame, back up through the frame to the motor controller, and then back down again, and then off to the motor and some of the other connections. Kind of an odd thing to do. I think it would have made more sense maybe to have the battery pop out the side and have the controller at the bottom so you could shorten all those cable lengths, but that's the way it is. So the motor controller, as I said, is located in here, inside the frame. Thankfully, we don't need to get to that. So this piece right here can actually stay in place. We don't need to pull that off because we can get to this connector right here. This is the one going to the battery. We do need to unplug that. If for some reason you can't see this connector right here and it's tucked up in there, you could try tugging that down gently, but if it's not there, you're gonna have to pull this piece off to get to the plugs you need to. But if everything is like this bike, you don't have to pull this off. This bottom piece where the battery plugs in, we do need to pull that off. There's 2 screws on this. There's one here and one here. These are black. One is countersunk. The countersunk screw is on the top, and the other one that's not countersunk is sitting down on the bottom. And these are using a small Torx bit. I don't know why they switched from a hex on the other fittings to Torx on those, but that's what we got. And these need a T10. Let's pull out the screw in the bottom. It does at least make it easier when you're putting things back together. The 2 that are black go into the plastic piece that is black, and the silver ones go into the silver metal piece. And again, that one is not countersunk and this one is, so you can tell the difference between the 2 and which one goes where when you put them back together. Now you can feel that this piece is loose at this point. If it doesn't want to move, it might just be that your cables are tucked up nice and tight behind this, either in the frame or just underneath the frame. So at this point, you might have to start cutting off some zip ties or any fasteners that are down here so you can get this out. Make sure not to cut any of your wires. There we go. And you can see that all this does is run from here down to the battery connection. So instead of this cable running up to the motor controller, it's actually going to run back to the new motor controller. So we can unplug this right here. And really the only reason I need to take this piece out is so we can run this wire that direction. Otherwise, we wouldn't have even had to take all of this apart. So now I'm going to grab the new motor controller. We have the motor cable. Now this cable is quite a bit longer than it needs to be, honestly. So you are going to just have to bundle this up a little bit so you don't have all the excess cable going back to the motor. You can do that once you actually have it installed. Just be aware that yes, it is longer than it needs to be, and that's because we're trying to make these compatible with multiple models of bikes. Better to have it too long than too short. The 2-pin connector that looks like this is the one that connects to the bottom end of the battery cradle. So that means this is also now going to be a lot longer than it needs to be, because originally it was running up, now it's running back. It really only needs to be a few inches long. We're not going to cut or change it or anything. Just be aware that you have some extra cable to tie up using some zip ties, and that's totally normal. And then our last connector here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, if I counted that right. Let me count that again. 1, 2. So this connector has 11 pins, very different from the others. This is the only other one we need to find. So I've just disconnected this plug. You can see there's this kind of block that has multiple connections going in and out of it. And one of them coming out of it, the fattest one, I guess you could say, is right here. And this is going up to the stock motor controller. So this just isn't going to be plugged into anything. And this side is what's going to plug into the new motor controller. So I'm going to roughly position my motor controller about here, kind of get an idea of where I want my cables to go. I want them to go inside this triangle right here. So I'm going to fish these through here first. And it's only these 3 plugs I need to connect. So I'm first going to grab that one with the 11 pins and connect it to this wiring harness right here where I just disconnected it. And if you look closely, I don't know if this will show up on camera, but there is a pin, like a plastic pin on one side, so you can only plug it in one way. These connectors that have a lot of pins are the most likely to get damaged when you're moving things around and you're not paying attention. Make sure this goes in nice and straight. You don't bend any of these pins, because if any one of those is not connected, your bike's not going to work. You have a couple of arrows to help you line it up, and the logo will actually be lined up as well. Push that together nice and firm so there's no extra lines sticking out. So again, this is the cradle piece I removed. I'm going to feed this wire down through the frame. There is a hole in the bottom there it's going to come out of. Now I've got that cable out, and I can plug these two in together. Again, it's just 2 pins. There's also a little groove and a slot so it can only go together one way, and there are arrows to make sure they're lined up. And all of this excess wiring we can kind of shove up into the frame as much as possible. There's a little bit of room right in there, and then whatever's left over, we're just going to tidy up as best as we can right underneath here with some zip ties when we're all done. And our last and third plug for the motor controller is the motor cable. There's one zip tie that I had to cut off right here. You'll probably have a second one right here. Just unplug that guy once you get to that point. I'm going to go ahead and plug in our new motor cable. Now our new motor controller is connected. So here's the motor cable from the stock controller. It's running down the frame here, and I'm just going to put a loop down there and tuck it behind the battery connection. And now I can put those 2 screws back in. Now I could mount the controller and tidy up the wiring down here at this point, but I am going to wait on that because I'd like to know that everything is actually plugged in the right spot and it's all working. So let's put on the display next. I actually don't even need to mount it. I can just plug it in at this point, pop the battery on, turn the bike on. If everything turns on, motor spins up and everything, then I feel pretty good about cinching everything down. There are 2 plugs on the stock display. You have a connection here that's just connecting the display in the center to the buttons in the display on the left-hand side, and then you have a second connector that's going down to the wiring harness. The new display just has a single connector, so I really just need to disconnect this one right here. And if you pop that apart, it's going to be green on the inside. It's a 5-pin connector. Again, there's a notch, so you can't plug it in the wrong way. Take your new display and plug it into the wiring harness. I can unplug with one hand. I don't think I can plug that back in with one hand. And now, with that plugged in, our motor controller plugged in, I should be able to pop the battery back on, press the power button on here, and everything should light up. Let's see if I did it correctly. Oh, it's upside down. Area 13, yay! 51.8 volts. I've got a headlight on, which it is in fact on. Pedal assist settings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But right now I just want to make sure that the motor works. So let's put this into pedal assist 1. Just gonna lean the bike just off on its kickstand. And that brake clearly needs some adjusting, but yes, motor works. Let's get this thing all buttoned up and finalized. Probably a good idea to turn this back off. Okay, so you can pull off the stock display. You've got 1 screw hidden right underneath there for the button side, and then there's 2 screws right here for the center display. You'll notice on the new display a couple of sets of screws. You've got these that clamp down on the handlebars, and then you also have these ones on the side. Those are so you can rotate it. If you loosen that just a little bit, you can feel there's some detents in there, so they kind of snap into different positions so you can have the screen facing you at a comfortable angle. I almost forgot, I need to put that tray back in first. Don't forget that. These mounts for the display are plastic. You don't need to tighten them all the way down. Just tighten it till it's snug and this doesn't want to wiggle around. Just a single screw to tighten down the button. There's a little extra length right here, so I'll probably use a zip tie to kind of clean the handlebars back up. But other than that, they're done. I've got a small handful of zip ties. When we ship these out, I'll make sure we throw some of these in. I'm gonna use these to clean up the loose wiring, just a tiny bit up by the handlebars, and then this little bit of a bundle that's down here. For now, I'm gonna zip tie the motor controller onto the frame right here. Maybe there could be a cleaner, better mounting solution, but that's gonna work. I'll see what I come up with later. Wires are all bundled up down there. The more time you spend on it, the prettier it will look. I didn't spend a lot of time on it. I did use 3 zip ties on the motor controller for right now. I used one here, and one around the top, because that means it can't move basically side to side. So a little bit of wiggle, but it can't go anywhere. I mean, I'm shaking the whole bike just by doing that. Make sure your cables are out of the way of your crank on the left side, and also the chain on the right side. And I'm embarrassed to say that I installed the display upside down, so now I gotta turn that around. Everything's installed and working, screen is programmed, so it's time to hit the road for a few minutes, see what the power is like on this new upgrade kit. So again, this is a 35 amp max. This is not the same kit that we were selling for prior Radrover bikes. Now I know other companies have come out with the KT controller, but I wanted something new and improved and better. So this controller is more sealed from the elements, so I think it'll be better suited for really wet climates. People are gonna have it out in the weather more often. It might hold up better in the long term. You might notice that you can't really hear much right now from the motor. If you've used one of the KT upgraded controllers, some people notice that there's a little more noise, and it's not a huge amount, but if you compare stock to the upgrade, certainly it's there. And that's because the KT controller is a square wave, the stock controller is a sine wave. So the sine wave is a little more efficient and it's a little bit quieter. And I am noticing that right now. I'm in pedal assist 2 and super quiet. And I think the difference in efficiency would be very, very small, but in theory, the sine wave should be a little bit more efficient as well. But of course, the reason you're really here is probably for the power. So I'm gonna turn it all the way up to 5, hit full throttle, and see how it feels compared to the stock bike. So here we go in 1, 2, 3. Yeah, that was a good launch off the start. 10 miles an hour, 15, 16, 18, 20, 21, 22, and 23 miles an hour, coming up to a stop sign. Acceleration is much quicker. It's smooth. It's not like jerky or abrupt, but it does take off substantially quicker. Let's head up some hills. So I'm going uphill right now at 21 miles an hour. Not bad. And I'm not even pedaling, I'm just using the throttle. The way this display and screen is programmed, the pedal assist setting does affect how much power the throttle gives you. So just that's something that's a little different. This is a much steeper hill. I'm slowing down a little bit. We're still doing 19.5 miles an hour. 18.5. Back up to 19. So up that hill, only slowed down to just over 18 miles an hour. Let's see, top speed downhill. That's 32 miles an hour. So I'm still feeding power to the motor. That's really over the RPM capability. But it seems like depending on your tire pressure, the terrain, your top speed's probably gonna be somewhere between 23 and 25 miles an hour, it looks like. I'm doing 25 right now. Might be an ever so slight downgrade. There's just a little bit of a hill right here, up and down. But everything just works. I didn't have to program pedal assist settings, motor settings. Really steep hill here. That's definitely slowing us down. I mean, I'm not pedaling at all. Slowed down to 10 miles an hour. That's a super steep hill. But kind of like the KT controller that we used on the previous bikes, it's just a night and day difference power-wise on the bike now. It feels like a whole new bike. It feels like a proper 750 watt continuous bike with a peak power that's, whoa, with a peak power that's definitely over 1,000 watts. Now that is one thing that is missing from this display is the wattage. So I can't see what the actual power draw is in real time, but it does have some other interesting stats on it. But we do have the time of day. You can actually set the clock time. You have a battery voltage, speed, your sys setting. There's a battery meter. We've got trip meter, odometer, average speed, max speed. Power on button is right on the bottom. There are different headlight settings. There's an automatic mode, so it'll detect if you're in the shade in the sun and turn your brightness up and down automatically. If we hold the up button, we can turn the headlight on. Ta-da! Hold it again, turns the headlight off and the screen to the full brightness. So from the main screen here, you have, again, your speed in the center, battery voltage on the top right, time right in the middle. We have the trip meter, odometer, average speed, max speed. I need to reset some of those from testing. They're all wonky at the moment. Now, if you press the mode button, you can get a little more information. So we have the battery voltage. Now, some of these options here are going to be blank and they're not going to work just because this display and motor controller are capable of more than what the Rad Power bike is. So it could track battery cycles and capacity and things like that if the battery had that built in. Unfortunately, it doesn't. So clicking through a couple of those screens, here's an interesting one, I guess. We can see riding mode usage. So you can see I used pedal assist 1 3% of the time, pedal assist 2 14% of the time. I didn't use 3 or 4 enough to even register, and I used pedal assist 5 82% of the time. Of course, I wanted to test out the max power, so that makes a lot of sense. And then back to the main screen, so we have our up and down arrows, and that's going to change the assist levels between 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. To get into additional settings, you turn the display on, and right after turning it on, hold down the middle mode button. The screen wasn't on very bright. I need to see if I can change the brightness first. Let's try that. Will that let me do that? I don't know if this is going to work. Yeah, it does. Great. Okay, so here we can change the units from miles per hour to kilometers an hour, or vice versa. We can set the time of day. This one I find really interesting. There is a maintenance schedule of sorts you could set on here. So if you want to check your chain or your tire pressure or your battery capacity or something like that, every so often you can actually put an interval in here, and every 1,000 miles, 500 miles, whatever it is, it'll actually put up a reminder and say, hey, it's time for maintenance. I just have that off right now. The backlight has 5 levels of brightness that you can adjust. It's summertime and bright, so I have it turned up to the max. Auto sleep, that's when the display controller turn themselves off. So if I just leave the bike sitting here, it's going to turn itself off after 5 minutes. Password, if you want to password protect the bike when you turn it on so somebody can't hop on and write it, you can set a password. Display info is just the firmware versions. There's nothing you can do with that. In fact, I don't know how to go back from that. There we go, just hold the mode button. Battery info, that goes back to the fact that the battery doesn't have that information built in, so it's not going to show up here. If the battery was smarter, we'd have some data there. Controller info, nothing that matters shows up there. And advanced settings is like if you were using completely different hardware with this motor and controller, but everything is designed to work specifically on the Radrover 6. So that's what I was saying about programming is super easy. You don't have to go through all the P1 through 5 settings, the C1 through 15 settings like on the KT controllers. You basically just plug this in and it works. So I actually like that about it. If you want something really simple and easy to use, the installation does take a little bit more work than the older bikes, but that's just because of how the new bikes are set up. But this is it right here. I've got my wires tucked up right underneath here. I've got my controller mounted right here. It's nice and sealed up. All the wires are running through and under the frame like they originally were, and the screen up here. So if you're looking for the latest and greatest upgrade for the newest Radrover model. Here it is. You can find it at area13ebikes.com. I'm happy to say that these are not on pre-order. They're actually in stock already. You can buy them right now and we'll ship them out immediately. If you want to learn more about electric bikes, upgrading electric bikes, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, make sure to check out the Area 13 podcast in both audio and video format. If you're more into extreme power settings, far beyond things like the Radrover, also check out our second channel called Area 13 Mischief. Recumbent trike that can do 50 miles an hour, 6,000 watt mopeds, maybe some motorcycles in the works. But of course, I'll keep all of the sane, normal e-bike stuff right here.